a esperar a que... Bueno, buenos días, tardes, lo que sea a todos. Gracias por acompañarnos en una nueva edición de los coloquios del Cabe del CIMA. En la tarde de hoy tenemos a la doctora Keryn Gedan. Espero no, ok. Ella es profesora asociada en Ciencias Biológicas en la Universidad de George Washington. Se recibió en la Tufts University y también hizo su PhD, su doctorado en biología o evolución en biología. Ella está en Buenos Aires desde agosto, entiendo, hasta diciembre con una beca Fulbright y nos va a hablar hoy de Sea Level Rise Effects on Coastal Forests. Gracias.
Gracias. Y voy a hablar en inglés, pero entiendo perfectamente el español y puedo hablar en español, pero más claro en inglés. Entonces, si quieres preguntarme en español, por favor, hágalo. So I'm going to tell you a story today about how sea level rise is affecting the coastal zone. I really appreciate you all taking time out of your day to come hear about my research, and I hope that this will start a number of conversations with you, that I can get to know you better. I'm here for several more months, and so we have plenty of time to meet and talk and get lunch or coffee. My lab is a coastal ecology lab, and we study global change. So I know it's a little bit biological for the department, but I think it will interest you what I have to say in terms of how the ocean is affecting the coastal zone. And I also wanted to mention that I'm recruiting a graduate student currently. So if you know of good students who might want to do a PhD in the United States, please tell them to come talk to me. My applications are due in early December. My lab is part of a number of big science networks in the United States that are funded by the National Science Foundation. And the two that I'll talk about today are the Virginia Coast Reserve Long-Term Ecological Research Site. And this is the Long-Term Ecological Research Network, is a number of sites across the United States, both continental and in Alaska and Hawaii, Puerto Rico, and where the data is collected for very long periods of time. So the advantage of the long-term ecological reserves is that the measurements can transcend the normal grant cycle. They extend for decades. So the site that I've been working at was established in 1987. So we have going on 40 years of data. The other network is much more new, but it's called the Critical Zone Network. It's very interdisciplinary. And my site is called, or my group of sites are called the Coastal Critical Zone. So we're the only member site of the network that's in the coast. And the idea of the critical zone is to study connections between soil, groundwater, plants, and atmosphere. And so we have scientists that are hydrologists, geologists, biogeochemists, and ecologists working together on this project. So a lot of my science is informed by this kind of long-term and interdisciplinary perspective of working with many collaborators. My own background is in coastal wetlands, so mangroves and salt marshes, and it's kind of my happy place. So I did my graduate degree looking at how climate change affects plant productivity and plant species composition in coastal wetlands using, let me use the pointer on the computer, using these little open top chambers, they're called, to elevate the temperature of the air in the wetland environment in a mesocosm, and look at the changes that ensued. My graduate work was subtidal, but also in coastal mangrove forests here, where I was looking at some of the effects of low oxygen, low dissolved oxygen, and acidification of those environments. So I love coastal wetlands. I think they're really beautiful places and important places. They're also really important from an ecosystem service perspective. They provide a lot of common goods. So this is a list of some of the ecosystem services they provide. In a study in 1997, when Costanza, an economist, tried to quantify all the ecosystem services provided by the natural environment, tidal wetlands were found to provide the most valuable services on a per area basis. So this is validated by economists, but we also know just from our experience that they are important storm barriers to the coastal developed areas. They also prevent erosion from the coast and protect a lot of properties. They are carbon sinks, really important globally, carbon sinks, especially considering the small amount of area that they cover. They produce a lot of important fishery species like crabs, shrimp, and fish that we like to fish and eat. And they're also important for biodiversity. So they house a lot of rare and endangered species, like this whooping crane, which is a globally endangered species. But something that's really interesting about them to me, and also a good reason to study their response to sea level rise, is the importance of the plant ecosystem engineering in these environments. So the plants play a really important role that actually is the foundation for the whole ecosystem. For that reason, these species are called foundation species. And when the species die and are lost from the system, the entire ecosystem can wash away. So what is this feedback? It is that when the plants establish, they slow the water flow across the sediment. This causes more suspended sediments to fall out of solution and accumulate in the soil. And it creates a process we call vertical accretion as the soil builds in the vertical dimension. And this is a process that allows these habitats to actually keep up with sea level rise at low rates. And there's additional feedbacks here. One of them is that as these grasses are more submerged, they actually become more productive up to a point. And so as sea level rise rates increase, there's more biomass there to trap more sediment, and the rate of vertical accretion also increases. So it's a really interesting feedback between the plants and the ecosystem. So that's one reason that it's interesting to study sea level rise in these environments. Another reason is that sea level rise in the region where I live and work is increasing at a very dramatic rate. So I live in Washington, DC, and I work nearby on the coast at the Virginia Coast Reserve, which is right in the middle of this mid-Atlantic sea level rise hotspot. So you can see the warm colors represent sea level rise rates that are greater than the national average on this map, and they're actually much greater than the global average as well. The reasons for this are land subsidence of the coast in my region. So the land is actually becoming lower due to recovery from glacial processes. And also a number of oceanic factors, including that the Gulf Stream, the primary current nearby, goes offshore and is weakening. But the end result is that in my region, we're experiencing larger floods that come further inland more frequently. And so I purchased this image from a photographer who took a picture of the tidal basin in Washington, DC on a day when it was flooded. This is called sunny day flooding, meaning there's a flood, but there's no storm at all. So this is just an extreme high tide that flooded areas you can see from the park bench are normally kept dry for tourists. And you can see some of the very iconic Washington monuments in the background. So this is right in downtown Washington, DC, which even Americans don't realize that this is actually a tidal system where in Washington, DC, in our nation's capital, because similar to Buenos Aires, it's a fresh tidal system. So the water is absolutely freshwater river system, but still tidal. So what I'd like to present to you today is kind of my rationale for studying this system, and then a few projects that I've done here to understand the changes happening in my region in this coastal zone due to sea level rise. So I'll talk first about how sea level rise is connected to forest retreat and what's happening to coastal wetlands, then about the scale and distribution of land use changes to sea level rise, and then how will future marsh plant communities resemble, and will it look like the marshes of today? And lastly, how does sea level rise kill trees? And these are kind of from an ecological perspective. So I definitely, I'll try to take some time to make sure I'm clear about the variables and things like that. But if you have questions at the end, I'm excited to answer them. So first of all, tidal wetlands exist in this very narrow range, elevation range along the coast between mean sea level and mean higher high water. And so that defines the boundaries of the ecosystem, because these plants are very stress tolerant to being underwater for half the day, where these soils are saturated and anoxic. They can tolerate the salinities, but they're not very good competitors. So when they meet upland species, they can't compete. So we see them living in this very narrow zone between where they can't tolerate the stresses of being underwater and where other plants outcompete them. So it's only this narrow zone, and you can imagine that as sea level rises, these tidal datums are also shifting. And then you have this range upslope where there's kind of tidal influence very infrequently. So an annual storm or so will inundate this transitional zone. And above that on the slope, you have areas that are very infrequently inundated that we call uplands. So these are not tidally influenced ecosystems. So we can use these elevation distributions and land cover data to define what's in the coast and predict how it will change. And this is a model that's very commonly employed to do this. That's called the sea level affected marshes model. What's unique about the model is, instead of just being a quote bathtub model of coastal change, it also includes the response of wetlands that I was telling you about to be able to vertically accrete in response to sea level rise. So it's a more accurate model than a bathtub model. And it's also always being improved. So this is the latest iteration, and these results were released in 2021. This is this was a study done of the Chesapeake Bay estuary, and I'm going to talk a lot about the Chesapeake Bay. It's the largest estuary in the United States. It's a comparable size about to the Rio de la Plata estuary, and it's also home to Washington, D.C. and my study sites. So this is the land cover data in 2010, with high marsh in orange, low marsh in teal blue, coastal forests in green, open water in dark blue, and other upland ecosystems in red. So you can see how they change through time. So this is the prediction with a very best case scenario of sea level rise. So this is the very lowest expectation for 2100 by the IPCC, is that there will be 0.59 meters of sea level rise, and you can see all the high marsh converts to low marsh. And the track that we're following right now is more akin to this pathway. This is business as usual, or the RCP 8.5, if you're familiar with the IPCC pathways. This is 1.23 meters of sea level rise, and you can see the whole system here converts to open water. This area that I'm showing you is a protected area in the United States. This is a national wildlife refuge where this area has been set aside mostly to protect migratory birds, because this is a really important stopping site for migratory birds in the Northern Hemisphere. So this is the migratory birds come to feed and use the wetlands, and this is very disconcerting to see that the whole place will become open water by 2100. So our major concern here is marsh habitat loss due to sea level rise. And we've seen this already, that several islands, actually over a dozen islands within the Chesapeake Bay, have disappeared due to sea level rise. So we know that this habitat loss is occurring. But most of the research to date has been on this vertical dimension. How do we measure this vertical dimension? We have a tool called a surface elevation table. That's really a geologist tool. It has a stable benchmark steel rod that's driven down into the sediment very, very deep. And we come back every year and connect this arm and drop pins down to the very surface of the soil. And we measure year after year where that surface is within a millimeter of accuracy at the very same place. So I take these data for the Virginia Coast Reserve Long-Term Ecological Research Site. This is a picture of my technician measuring the pins. And we have over 20 years of data. And this is how the data looks with the surface elevation through time from 1997 to 2017. And what we see is that over time, there's quite a linear rate of accretion of 4.9 millimeters per year, which is right within the range of the long-term rate of sea level rise. So it varies. We don't have a tidal station right next to this site, but the tidal stations around are between 3.5 and almost 6 millimeters per year of sea level rise through the last several decades. So this site is keeping up with sea level rise, which is really positive, but we also see this happening, that the lower marsh seems to have a higher rate of increase or accretion relative to the middle and high marsh, indicating that we expect to see conversion of the high marsh to low marsh through time. So that's in the vertical dimension. But something that has not really been acknowledged very much in the past decades is that these habitats can also move in the horizontal direction. And that's kind of the basis of my research program. This is a study done on Delaware Bay, not by me, looking at aerial photography of the boundary between the marsh and the forest within Delaware Bay and adjacent estuary through time. And they saw this rapid rate of retreat of the forest from 1930 till about 2000 that accounted for about 2 meters per year of change in that boundary. And about half of the boundary, about half of the area change became salt marsh and half became this invasive species called Phragmites, which also lives in the coastal wetlands, but I'll talk about again later on because it's an invasive species and it's not very good habitat quality. So we do see that this is happening, and a way to conceptualize this change is that the ecotone, or the boundary between the forest and the marsh, is migrating across the landscape through time. And so it has this leading edge and a trailing edge, and this zone in between that we'll call the ecotone, that's a transitional zone with a lot of change in species composition. And in the wake of this migration, we see the emergence of a very interesting and novel habitat that we call a ghost forest, due to all of these standing dead trees that were killed by sea level rise, that lose all their branches and leaves, but the trunks tend to persist. And in the understory, in the ground level, we see all the marsh grasses coming in. So we've never really seen this except in paleo records. In today, this is a novel habitat. So it's been really, and because we have these high rates of sea level rise in my region, we are seeing a lot of these emerge. This is just another image of the ghost forest where you can see all of these standing dead trees and marsh grasses beneath. And with a colleague, we searched to try to find out where these are occurring. And we found records of them from Canada, from the east coast of the US, like New Jersey, and even in Florida, sort of the this odd type of ghost forest where there are forests of palm, sable palm, and still see ghost forests emerging from palm tree trunks. So they're occurring in different forest types and across a wide geography. part of the reason that I came to South America is to see if I could find this happening in South America as well. So I'm really interested to look around in the coastal zone and see if I can see evidence for migration of this terrestrial coastal wetland boundary here as well. So because these are a really visible sign of sea level rise, there's been a lot of interest from the media. And I think this is a really great opportunity to communicate with the public about climate change. So I'm always willing to talk to journalists. I'm actually talking to a journalist from Canada on Monday because they have another site where this is occurring and they want to educate people. So we got coverage from the New York Times, and nearly every year there's another article about this from some media outlet or another. And especially around Halloween, because we name them ghost forests, always in Halloween, people want to tell a ghost story. So I've learned it's really good to try to push out a paper in October so that I can capitalize on the media interest. So the first thing that we did was to really try to understand how quickly this is occurring and where. So we took land cover data from this coastal county in southern Maryland. So this is the Chesapeake Bay here. And this county is very low elevation and very shallow sloping. So it's very, very flat. The topography is here, and the whole map then is under 10 meters in elevation above mean sea level. So we took very high resolution imagery. There's a 1 meter by 1 meter pixel size. These are like really big, big data. And we looked at land cover transition between the time period where we had this high resolution data, which happened to be 2009 to 2017. So it's just 8 years. Usually when people do land cover change analysis, they try to get records for 50 or 70 years. Usually if you only have a decade, it's very difficult to actually detect change. But because this high resolution, we are able to detect it in all of the yellow areas pictured here. Then we looked at the landscape characteristics of the areas that had transitioned. And we found that they were more close to shore and more low elevation than the remaining pixels in the scene, indicating that the main driver of change in this region is sea level rise, because it's all about tidal influence and proximity to saltwater. We also looked at what land cover classes were changing and what they were changing to. So this is an alluvial plot. If you're not familiar with this type of plot, it looks like a lot like a spaghetti mess. But here's how you read this. These are all of the pixels that experienced a land cover transition between 2009 and 2017. This is the land cover class that they started in 2009. So you can see the largest class to transition was agricultural lands. And this is the land cover class where they ended up in 2017. So you can see the largest portion of agriculture became emergent wetland. The second largest class to transition was forest. And of this, the forest, 50% became scrub shrub wetland, and the other 50% became emergent wetland. So we can really visualize a lot of information through this type of plot. We also looked at the probability of transition to emergent wetland of every pixel that changed. And the agricultural land was actually more likely to transition to wetland than the forest. So we realized through this study just how much agricultural area is being influenced by sea level rise, and also that it seems to be even more vulnerable than the forests. And I have ideas about that. One reason is that the crops that we use and the style of agriculture that we use is very vulnerable to effects of salinity. So for example, corn is grown throughout the region, and that is a very intolerant plant to salinity. So from this study, we realized that in this short time period of 8 years, 1% of the county's farmland and 0.5% of the county's forest land transitioned to wetland. So change is occurring in this area very fast. And we found that these farmlands are especially vulnerable. So this kind of launched for me a whole branch of research into what's happening on these farmlands. And I have a number of projects working directly with farmers to see if we can find alternative crops for them and to understand the implications of the change, and also to look at restoration candidate species, whether we can take these lands that are being abandoned because of sea level rise and turn them into good habitat for marshes for the future. So this is what some of the agricultural lands affected by sea level rise look like, taken with a drone that my colleague uses over this past summer. And you can see these bare areas in the farms that are where the crop failed because of salinity, and there's no other vegetation there because of the style of agriculture that we use that uses broad scale herbicides to kill everything else. And then the crops that we use are herbicide tolerant crops. And I'm sure it's the same here too. That's the reason that these appear totally bare soils. And while this is, it's disturbing to see, I guess, a crop field in this bad condition, but one advantage is it produces a really bright spectral signal in the imagery. And so one thing I'm doing with a colleague is mapping the areas of bare soil to be able to detect the scale of change across a regional scale. And then we are trying to track changes in that through time to be able to know what's happening for these farmers. And this is a soy field experiencing the same pattern. And this is a close-up of the cornfield. You can see that all of these fields are ringed with ditches that were constructed to drain the field of fresh water and keep it drier in the wet season. But now they're conduits for salt water, and they bring salt water up to the field. So obviously this is a process that affects people. You know, that's one of the messages of my talk. And people did not know that agriculture was being affected by sea level rise in the Mid-Atlantic region prior to this study. So that has been an important message for policymakers and for farmers, and it has provided a lot of opportunity for me for stakeholder engagement to work directly with farmers and the farming community. So we ran some workshops, and every year I have a stakeholder meeting with the farmers on whose property we're working, with a public question and answer period. And it's been really meaningful to me to engage with them and also to learn from them, you know, how they're adapting to this, what do they see as the scale of the problem, and are there any other questions, you know, research questions that I can answer for them that will help them adapt to the changing coast. And it's also been important for policy, public policy. So I was able to author this report by the state that's Maryland's plan to adapt to saltwater intrusion and salinization. And Maryland has been really responsive to the problem. So they're actually coming up with a new form of easement. It's like a kind of subsidy payment that they can provide landowners who are losing the ability to farm on their land. And they're using that to try to help people adapt to the changes. And then there was also a USDA report on which I was able to serve as a reviewer on the same topic at a federal scale. And like I said, this has been important for stakeholder engagement and public involvement. So I launched a citizen science project, both to, you know, give people a resource where they could find more information if they saw a ghost forest, but also to collect information and try to figure out where exactly these things are occurring, because I really only know my own region. So I made this story map website that also contains a survey link. So these are QR codes. You can point your phone at them and take a picture, and it'll send you to a link of the story map site where you can learn about ghost forests, but also where you can contribute an observation if you see ghost forests. You can upload a photo and it'll put a point on this map. So we launched this in 2020, And we've had 45 observations to date. And every one of these is kind of quality checked. But it gives you a good idea of the distribution of ghost forests within the United States. So I'm excited, to be able to know where the ghost forests are and to continue to populate this map to understand where change is happening. So I'm really hoping to put a South American point on this map really soon. So the next question is, what are the future marsh communities going to look like, and will they resemble today's communities? So this is an ecological experiment that I'm doing. Right now it's in a phase of observational data, but starting next year, we're moving into an experimental phase. So we're looking at a forest that's transitioning due to sea level rise. It's going to become a ghost forest. You can see dead trees along the edge. And we're studying across the elevation gradient to know how things are changing at different forest levels. So the experiment that we're going to do is a disturbance experiment. We're going to intentionally kill the trees in half of our research plots to simulate a death of a forest due to saltwater inundation. So we'll kill the trees at these different forest levels, one that's about to turn into ghost forest and one where the forest is more healthy, and try to detect differences between the trajectory of those ecosystems to answer these research questions. So this is what the site looks like. So it's on the Virginia Coast Reserve. This is the Chesapeake Bay, and this is the Atlantic Ocean. And it's on the mainland of this Delmarva Peninsula that is in the mid-Atlantic of the United States. These plots are each 20 meters by 20 meters, and the whole site is about 200 meters. So we have this area we call high forest, mid forest, and low forest based on some different characteristics or how close they are to transitioning to the ghost forest. And it's a very flat area, again, that's elevation differences between these levels are on the scale of 5 centimeters. So there's really more variation within a plot than between the plots. And this we call a space for time approach, because we expect that the low forest at some time in the past resembled the high forest. And so we can make predictions by understanding just differences across this gradient of what will happen to the high forest in the future. The area is inundated pretty regularly. We didn't know this when we set up the site, but we got our first flood. We set up the site in January 2019, and we had our first flood in October 2019. And since then, we've had many more floods across the site. And it's really interesting. We've learned a lot from these floods because we see that the salinity in the groundwater spikes when there's a flood up to oceanic levels of salinity, and then it takes months to return to baseline. So there's periods of stress for the forest in here that are really elevated, but during the whole flood period and the recovery period, the salinity gradient is actually maintained so that the low forest is the saltiest area, the mid forest less so, and the high forest less so. So it's this kind of episodic stress that's killing the forests. And interestingly, this inundation was during Tropical Storm Melissa, but this was an example of sunny day flooding. The tropical storm was well offshore, and it just resulted in a very high tide. So we're taking a lot of ecological data at this site. I kind of lumped them or grouped them into 3 different areas of the forest based on the forest structure. So we have canopy measurements looking at the dominant tree in the forest, which is a pine tree, loblolly pine. And we're taking all these data to look at how those trees are performing. Then we have our sub-canopy measurements. We're looking at shrubs and also that invasive species, Phragmites. And then the herbaceous layer or the ground cover, looking at seedlings, which tells us about the future of the forest, what species are there in the understory, and is it turning to marsh? and then litter fall to understand some ecosystem cycling, energy cycling within the ecosystem. And the way we do litter fall is put out these laundry baskets, and we collect all the leaves that fall in month after month. So one thing that changes dramatically across the gradient, as you'd expect, is canopy cover and leaf area index. So this is what the healthy forest looks like, a relatively closed canopy of pine trees. The stressed forest, you can see a lot of light gaps and areas where trees have died. And then the ghost forest or the low forest has almost no tree cover. And we take leaf area index, which is just a measure of the density of leaf cover throughout the year to be able to, we just completed the first year of measurements to be able to see both the seasonal cycle in leaf area through the year. Even though these pines are evergreen, they also do senesce seasonally. They drop leaves seasonally, even though they stay ultimately green. And you can see differences between the forest levels here. The low forest has quite a short growing season, actually, we've found. There's also differences in tree species composition. So this is really interesting because this tells us some tree species are more vulnerable to salinity stress than others. There's differences in tolerance that result in species compositional change. So each of the bar colors indicates a species of tree. And you can see in the high forest here, there's a greater diversity of trees. And those species, the red and the yellow, are lost as you move into the mid and low forest. The dominant tree here is in green, that's the loblolly pine, and it persists throughout. And then there's also a red cedar, Juniperus virginiana, that recruits in and becomes really common in the low zone. Similarly, there's more dead trees in the low zone than in the high, and the species composition shifts a little bit because the juniperus are only present in the low and make up a bigger proportion of the dead trees as well. But what's exciting is we've been able to witness a lot of tree mortality events. So we've seen a total of 37 trees, or 6% of our census trees, have died over the first 3 years of our study. And we're interested to see what species are dying, where, and then understand what happens right before and after their death. We've also seen shrub expansion at the leading edge of this gradient. So we've seen the number of shrubs and the area that those shrubs cover increase really dramatically. It feels like the shrubs are marching through the forest, and this was a big surprise to us. So we didn't expect this, but these are just all the different variables related to shrubs. So canopy area, height, diameter, density, and basal area. And these are percent change over time for our study years of 2019, 2020, and 2021. I haven't had the opportunity yet to add 2022 to this data set, but we have the data. But you can see these increases are very dramatic, especially in the mid and high forest. In the low forest, they're less pronounced and the shrub component is more stable. That's why I say that this is happening at the leading edge of this transition. Interestingly, this shrub that's dominant is a nitrogen fixing shrub. And so that has potential to really change the ecosystem as well. So my next line of research is going to be about how that affects ecosystem processes like decomposition. And that invasive species that I mentioned to you, Phragmites australis, this is a really important species because it's invasive around the world. So it's a problem a lot of places. It's native to Europe, Central Europe. And it was introduced a long time ago in about 1900 to the coastal United States, the East Coast, and it's still in an expansion phase. So it's spreading to new sites, it's expanding also as the forest dies back, and it creates a monodominant stand where it's the only species present, and its structure is it's a very tall grass, like 4 meters tall. Whereas the native marsh grasses are all about like 1 meter or less. So it's a big change in the community, and it's not great habitat for the wildlife species. So we've been mapping where this species is across the site. And in these maps, red indicates an increase in Phragmites. blue indicates a decrease and gray indicates no change through time. So you can see there's a lot more red in the low zone here than in the high zone. And so this is a change, even though it becomes established in the high forest, it really expands in the low forest. So this is a change on the trailing edge of the ecotone migration. We also looked at the relationship between Phragmites and shrubs, wondering if there might be an interaction there that's interesting, but we found that spatially, at least, the species are pretty disconnected, and there doesn't seem to be any relationship. And lastly, the understory community. So I'm working from top down. The understory community is changing as well. This is an ordination plot that simplifies this multivariate, multi-species community to 2 dimensions. And so each one of these small gray points represents a sample plot in a given year and the community that's there. And so we can look at changes across this space between the forest levels as well as through time to understand if the community is changing in composition. So we have the low forest in dark blue, mid in light blue, and high in very light blue. And the years here are with 2019 in the circle, 2020 in the triangle, and 2021 in the square. And we can see then visualize that change through time. These are centroids, so basically averages in space of all the points in that category. So we can see that the low zone is shifting off in this direction, and actually the mid and high are following the same direction. So we know that species composition is changing through time in the understory from this, but the surprising aspect is that it's not changing in the direction that I expected it to, because I thought that the high zone was going to start to resemble the mid zone, and the mid zone would start to resemble the low zone in that space for time expectation. And in this case, the points would be moving towards one another, but they're actually all moving in the same orthogonal direction. So this tells us that this is kind of an unexpected change that I need more years and information to figure out why. So to sum up this observational data set, we see that these communities are changing a lot in predictable ways and unpredictable ways. So the predictable patterns are the filtering of sensitive tree species that we expected, and the expansion of Phragmites australis that we had seen in other studies. But we also have seen these unpredictable changes, such as the expansion of shrubs that has happened very quickly and dramatically, and this change in the understory that's going in a different direction than we predicted. So to sum up, we're not sure yet if the future communities that happen in these changing ecosystems will be the same quality, habitat quality as the marshes of today. So we have more work to see what happens. And I think the experiment that we're going to do, killing all the trees in half of these plots, is going to help us to understand what will happen. So lastly, how does sea level rise kill trees? We're doing a physiological study to understand what's happening with the trees, and using these sensors that are sap flow sensors. So just tell you about their design, because I think it's pretty interesting how they work. They're 3 metal probes that you literally plug into the tree. It feels very funny to plug something into a tree. But these probes have a central heating probe that emits a heat pulse every 15 minutes. And then 2 detector probes that have thermistors to detect when the heat pulse passes by through the water column of the tree. And it tells you about how water moves through the tree. It's really important that we have 3 probes, because a lot of these sensors are designed with 2. They have a heat emitting probe that can be, and then they can be detected just in one direction. And this presumes that all of the water in the tree is moving from the soil and the roots up towards the canopy, which is the normal direction that trees drink water. But with the 2 probes, we can actually see that on occasion, water will move down the stem of the tree towards the roots. And that's a really interesting finding that I'll show you in a minute. So what we found using this same experimental site, we instrumented 10 trees, 2 in the high forest, 4 in the mid, and 4 in the low forest. And we see really different rates of water use by these trees. So the response variable is sap flow density, and this just is normalized for the cross area of the tree trunk because we have trees of slightly different sizes to be able to compare across the entire site. And we see that the rates of water use are much higher in the high and mid plots, here H and M, relative to these low forest plots. And these trees are barely drinking water in the low forest, even though they superficially look healthy. We started all with trees that had a pretty green, full canopy. So this reflects lower whole tree photosynthesis, and over time, the reduced photosynthesis will essentially starve the tree. It won't be able to meet its energy requirements. It also has kind of interesting feedbacks to the system. So if you think about this gradient from the high forest, mid, and low, if there's lower individual tree water use in the low zone, that represents a positive feedback to water logging. So the less water that a tree uses, the more water stays in the soil. And that can be a stressor to the plant community there. So I'm really interested to work with some of my colleagues who are hydrologists to see if we can scale this up to a water budget and understand more about the water process in the soil. We also had a flooding event during the time that the trees were instrumented with these sap flux sensors, and we're able to see what the trees actually do with a saltwater flooding event around their roots. And this is just the hydrological data that shows this pulse, this rising of the water. So this is inundation of the groundwater and then a slow subsidence. And we saw that the groundwater salinity, as I showed you before, spikes and then takes a long time to recover. And this only shows a week after the flooding event. So the salinity persists for several weeks. But again, that salinity gradient was maintained across the site. So it looks like a rainbow. And this is what happened in our instrumented plots to the trees. So every day the trees exhibit a DL cycle or a day-night cycle in water use. So during the day they photosynthesize, and during the night when the sun is gone, they're quiet, they sleep. But on the day of the flood, indicated with this gray line, we saw that they did not use any water, they didn't photosynthesize, and they also had this negative sap flow event or reverse sap flow event. And we observed this across all trees across the entire site. So really surprised to see this. It was really unexpected. But basically the way trees work is through osmotic gradients. And so they're taking up water when there's more demand at their leaves than at their roots. And the osmotic gradient, when the roots are bathed in salt water, is reversed. So there's a big osmotic pull out of the roots that we think was pulling water down the trunk of the tree. So that's kind of our working hypothesis right now. Let's show you this in a little more depth. Here's the reverse sap flow event. This is just for 2 trees here. The day before the storm and their sap flow, the day of the storm and that negative sap flow event, and then 2 days after the storm. And this happened only during a period when the vapor pressure deficit was 0, meaning when the humidity was high and the rain was high. Therefore, there wasn't a lot of desiccation or evaporation happening at their leaf surfaces. So there's very little pull up the tree at this moment in the middle of the night and high humidity, such that the osmotic pull of the salt water around their roots was much stronger than what was happening at their leaves. But one interesting thing about reverse sap flow is it's known to cause problems in the vascular tissue of trees. And so it causes cavitation and embolism, basically bubbles that disrupt the connectivity of water flow through the tree, and it can reduce vascular tissue function into the future. So we think that this is actually another thing that's leading to the mortality of these trees. But down in South America, I've gotten the opportunity to talk to some eco-hydrologists, and that's been really interesting. And I've learned there's an alternate interpretation to this data that I'm really interested to explore. And that is that the trees are actually able to take up water at this point where there's a lot of water in the atmosphere through their leaves. And so when I showed this to an eco-hydrologist, he said, you can't rule that out based on this data. They might actually be taking advantage of the reversed osmotic gradient and able to pull in water from the atmosphere. So I think that's super interesting, and I'm excited to ask this question when I return home with some new data. So we're going to follow up on this study, looking at more species and more flooding events, seeing if we can reverse the flow of sap flow in pond experiments or in manipulative experiments, and also putting this data into a whole ecosystem water budget. So to sum up kind of the projects that I've told you about today, these are my general conclusions about coastal change in the mid-Atlantic. We've seen that sea level rise is reshaping coastal ecosystems, and that this is happening on a scale, an ecological scale, where we can track it year by year, because the changes are the scale of meters per year. So it can't really be ignored. That ghost forests are this highly visible sign of sea level rise and climate change that offers opportunities for outreach, engagement, and policy engagement. And that these ecological studies of the marsh forest transition has revealed ecological changes that are occurring, possible feedbacks in the ecosystem, as well as these physiological surprises. So I'm excited to keep working on this, as well as to expand my horizons geographically and include new species, new processes that are happening in other places in the world. I'd like to acknowledge all the students in my lab and postdocs and technicians that helped out with this work. And they're all pictured here on the left side of my screen. And then all my collaborators at other institutions who are pictured here on the right-hand side, and my funding sources from NSF, the USDA, NIFA program, and the LTER. Thanks for your attention.
Gracias, una charla súper interesante. Tenemos un ratito para preguntas. No sé si alguien quiere empezar. Tenemos un comentario de Olga Penalba en YouTube que dice que agradece por la charla y le parece también muy interesante.
Yo tenía una... Perdón.
No, dale, Pedro.
Tengo una pregunta, Keryn, sobre esa actividad que hiciste con los stakeholders de esa parte del estudio. Que me impresionó esto de que contaste que ellos no veían, no vinculaban lo que pasaba en el terreno con los métodos y me preguntaban, y por otro lado tenés toda esa ciencia ciudadana de la gente que te manda las fotos de los forests. Me preguntaba si había un vínculo entre esas dos cosas, si la gente que tiene, digamos, si hay una percepción distinta ahora, si hay una percepción distinta, digamos, si hay un vínculo, digamos, si se pueden ver vínculos ahora de lo que está pasando, digamos, no solo les pasa eso, sino también pasa en los ecosistemas.
So
como un cambio de percepción, digamos.
Yeah, it's not the same people contributing the photos. The farmers are probably not the ones contributing the ghost forest photos. Though they do notice the ghost forest much more. It's a much more visible sign, these dead trees. It's like you can't ignore it. You're like, you see a dead forest, what happened there? But the farmland, it's much more patchy, smaller areas. And there are a lot of reasons that farms don't perform in this area. There's like climate variability. There's years they have to sow seeds twice because there's a rain event that kills all the seeds. So when I started talking to them about this problem of sea level rise and salinity on their land, they said, oh yeah, we have that, but it's number 15 in a long list of problems. And before salinity, we need someone to take care of all the deer that are eating our crops, and someone to help us because the prices for our crops are too low and we can't make ends meet. So for them, it's just like one more thing that makes it difficult to be a farmer. So they, there wasn't like an effort to connect with other farmers having the same problem, and an effort to, is there anything we could do, or best practices we can develop. There wasn't that attitude, but there is now. They've really changed how they're interested. But yeah, and then the people contributing the ghost forest images, for some of them, we did small trainings. So like I had a student who talked to a class in Georgia, and then the class had an assignment, go out to their environment and see if they can find one to contribute to the citizen science effort. So yeah, I think we still have a lot of education to do, but also the press helps. If they read an article and then they know a name to call it, suddenly they can make a report. So I'm trying to get the word out about the survey along with the media articles. So every journalist, I say, hey, I have this effort. You could put the link in your, in your links on the page.
Okay, so thank you very much, and congratulations. It's incredible work. And I have a lot of questions, but I will try to make it important. So I was going to ask the same as Pedro. I was also like astonished by the fact that the farmers hadn't noticed that these patches were salty, but now I understand why. But I wonder if this perception that they have, if that is because of the tradition that it happened, the salt intrusion happened also very, very seldom.
So
And now
it's happening more frequently.
Now it's,
I think that is part of it too. Like I've talked to farmers. I mean, first of all, these are some of the oldest farmlands in the entire United States. So we have one farmer who actually, his family has been farming that land since the 1600s, his family. So it's really interesting to talk to these people. And some of them have told us, oh yeah, we have a field back there we used to farm and now it's marsh. So I have done some research on these areas that have been abandoned from farming and sort of what the community looks like when you stop farming. So that's been interesting. But yeah, I think it is, as you say, like over the past 25 years, they abandoned one field. So it wasn't a huge pace of change that they really felt was a big problem. And yeah, now it seems to maybe be accelerating, but we don't really know if the pace, I mean, obviously sea level rise is accelerating. So we expect the rate of change to accelerate, but to actually detect that rate of change, we haven't done that yet. That's part of this effort with the geographer and using the satellite imagery. So we do right now, like we're about to submit a paper that has data from 2011 and 2017, and we saw a huge increase in these patches. And then the idea is to get even more data in the future and have more and more points. It's sort of in the early phase of understanding the scale of the problem. But yeah, because of the topography, it's not going to eradicate farmland in these coastal counties. It's always going to be a marginal problem. It's going to affect like maybe 2% of the landowners. And that's unfortunate because those people have a real hardship and other people no. So it's like another source of inequality in what's already a rather poor area. Yeah.
Have you studied also the interaction with other factors of global change, typically temperature or heat wave or general increase of temperature, also interacting with the increase of sea level with these ecosystems or other factors?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I haven't really done very much on that topic, even though I'm very interested in it. But we haven't done any specific studies, but I can tell you the factors that will be the most important. And so one that's we know is really important. So the salinity in the system, it's in the groundwater. And then there's also episodic inundation. So there's a sort of a press of stress as well as a pulse. And the press of stress we call saltwater intrusion because it's in the groundwater all the time. And that is very affected by precipitation regimes. So when you have a dry year, then the salts become very concentrated and it's higher salinity. And then if you have a very wet year, the salinity goes down and it's an easier year. So there's likely to be feedbacks with precipitation. And there could be a similar one with temperature as well, with evapotranspiration responding to temperature. One thing, this is like a brand new study that was another like a remote sensing study, looked at NDVI, this greenness index, and how areas around the coast are responding over time to basically to sea level rise. So they were looking at coastal forests and marshes and how greenness varied through time in this same study region. They found that at low elevation, NDVI of the forest is going down because the forests are dying due to sea level rise. At high elevation, it's actually trending up because temperature is going up and the forests are responding, and carbon dioxide is going up. The forests are responding positively. So there's probably some interaction as well. Like if the forests are responding to both, they're responding to both, and we need to know how they affect one another.
There is one question on Zoom. Santiago Salinas, he's asking, not knowing anything about plants may be a dumb question, but is the soil microbiome changing? Would this play a role in the changes in physiology?
So we don't right now have a microbiologist partner. We had someone take some samples like a few years ago, but then we need another set of samples to know if there's change. But there are some really important interactions in the soil that might be playing a role. So the pines partner with ectomycorrhizae, that's an important relationship for that plant. The shrub that I showed you is a nitrogen fixer, and so it has another bacterial partner that's really important. And then Phragmites, this invasive species, partners with our Bosco mycorrhizal species, so another fungal partner. So there's probably important interactions there, and I don't know what they are, but I think it's a super interesting future area of research. Yeah.
Now, from climatological viewpoint, study, this length of the study is very, very short. It's 3 years. So you said at one point that you were surprised that you saw results in the other direction that you expected. But from my viewpoint as a climatologist, I think that we have like the internal variability of the climate at least is much bigger than the trend of climate change. And looking at the dates of the storm surges, I mean, the storm surges are so much bigger than the millimeters that the mean sea level rise is per year, right?
Yeah. Oh,
so
yeah.
You had one in 2019, and then none in 2020, and several in 2021.
Yeah.
So
it's such a good. That's such a good point. That's such a good point. And I think that well, one thing. Okay, first of all, yeah, even sea level is all over the place, right? So if you have a 3-year period, it probably looks like a hump. So yeah, sea level, it's not changing in a very linear. Well, in short periods, not very linear. So I completely agree. Like one thing that surprised me about that accretion data set is it clearly is linear. Like the salt marsh is somehow time averaging the sea level rise curve. And I have no idea how that functions or why. Though there are other processes in there, but they're actually mostly controlled for in that data set. We take a lot of data, we take deep compaction data, we take surface accumulation data, all kinds of stuff. But I think like overall, we know we're seeing directional change in forest mortality. So the trees live very long lifespans. And so we're sort of like looking, it's a short-term window, but we're looking at long-term processes. So yeah, I've been trying to promote this idea in my lab of think like a tree. So, you know, these trees with this very narrow energy budget, like that's telling us how they perform. You know, the trees, for example, in the low zone that look healthy, they're actually like on death's door. So we need to kind of like look at that long time scale.
Understory then, does that have a shorter lifespan?
So maybe that explains the pattern that I see. Now the understory is interesting too, because there's all kinds of different plants there. So shrubs have a long lifespan. Grasses actually can have a long lifespan because they're clonal. And one of my graduate students found that the grasses in the understory, some of the marsh grasses are unable to flower. So their only mode of reproduction is clonal. So yeah, I think that's a really important perspective. I'd love to talk more with you about like how we might be able to tease apart the storms versus the long-term trend.
Keryn, ¿en cuánto tiempo una franja de bosque se convierte en un forest?
So that's kind of one of the questions that we had with this site, and we were trying to estimate that. So we did a couple different numbers to estimate it. One was if we started with if, you know, sea level rise continues at today's rate and the elevation distance, and I think that difference is like 323 years. But then we did another assessment based on like the pace of change we've been seeing from historical imagery and the way the boundary is moving, and we can track it. And then we got a number of 23 years. So those numbers are so different that I don't really know the answer. And yeah, if it's 23 years, well, first of all, it is within a century that this forest will entirely convert to a ghost forest. And that's why the landowners are going to let us do this big disturbance experiment and kill all the trees. We're working with the Nature Conservancy, so it's a land trust. But they said we could manipulate the forest because and a lot of coastal landowners have been very welcoming to us as scientists, because they also, you know, see the writing on the wall, know what's coming and that their forests are dying.
I have one question. I don't know if you are interested in carbon budget in these coastal wetlands, but do you have maybe an hypothesis about how this will change with the change in land use?
Yeah, that's a great question. Someone in my collaborator group has kind of done some analysis. So they looked at carbon stocks in the forest and in the transition zone and in the marsh. And they found that the carbon pool stored in the trees is enormous. And so the marsh and the forest have very different carbon pools, because in the forest, the carbon is stored in living biomass. And in the salt marsh, it's stored in these very organic peat soils. So over time, the salt marsh becomes a much better carbon storage sink than the forest. But at the current moment, we're losing trees, so we're losing carbon, and the soil accumulates very, very slowly. So there's about 200 or 300 years where it's a net deficit. And then it reaches a higher carbon sink as the marsh grows than it was in the forest.
Estamos un poco pasados, pero tenemos tiempo para una o dos preguntas más, porque está interesante la charla. No sé si alguien tiene.
I was confused by this very high grass that was forming there. So they have forest and then this high grass and then the marsh. And what you want is the marsh. So how will you get this high grass to here.
Yeah, well, yeah, I like that. Yeah, you totally get it. The marsh. So one thing that I've been promoting is that this Phragmites, the tall grass, colonizes at the leading edge, but becomes very abundant at the trailing edge. And so one thing we can do is eradicate it at the leading edge. And that will allow space for other species to come in. And it's actually really easy to eradicate if you do it while it's small. You can use an herbicide that's very targeted. So you just spray the plant, get rid of it, and you just have to monitor. So that's kind of a management application of the science.
So that is one solution, that is solution.
Yeah, so I've been telling everyone who will listen in the Mid-Atlantic that they need to go around with backpack sprayers and spray the Phragmites. Yeah.
Bueno, muchas gracias.
Muchas
Vamos a-